right, folks, we'll kick those tires and start that perpetually fake fire. We are camping today, and everyone knows who listens to this. To you, hundreds of dozens of listeners, and a way to couch that. I am so grateful whenever I get to interview an author, someone who has waged war against the blank page and emerged victorious. Our guest now, you've heard of the flight or fight response, I would say, and characterize our next guest as a flight, fight, and fright response. In fact, Stephen King has even been scared by him, and anyone knows there's no scaring Stephen King. So please put your Kindles, books, hardback, paperback, large print, whatever you got in your hands together, and please welcome the apostle, Paul Tremblay, winner of multiple horror awards, Bram Stoker awards. He is here virtually with us in some interdimensional sense. Paul, thank you so much for taking a flyer and being with us.
Thank you, Ryan. What an intro. I love it. Yeah.
That's what we're known for, actually, is lack of content, good intro. That's a good first date. And then after that, we sort of just tank. But it's so interesting. I love interviewing horror writers because I want people to see that you're normal. Now Stephen King aside, although I would consider him normal too, but there's an old joke. It says, what Stephen King's kids want him to tell him.
Oh, so I'm a Godzilla for your podcast.
That's
Makes
good.
a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get to Godzilla. But, Godzilla is also a complicated character because he's sort of an anti-hero that works with us. But I am so impressed with your work, and so is Stephen King. And have you found, this is just an incidental note, we have a show that's with a big horror company, a production company now, and everyone is the nicest person ever. And they said that's kind of the running joke, is that people who are creating horror and writing horror are actually very nice.
Every community's got their bad actors, obviously. But yeah, having gone to all sorts of different types of writing conventions, science fiction, fantasy, crime, the horror folks seem to be the most friendliest, partly because maybe we're the most desperate. Like us. Someone please like us. When we find other people like horror, it's almost, oh, one of us. And then we nerd out with them. So maybe that translates as being friendly.
One theory is that there's a lot of sort of, I'll call it outcasts, kids who are a little different, maybe in high school or whatever, the kind of Stranger Things that capture that. And then they basically turned into these epic curators of literature and horror. And I always say it's interesting because, and I don't know, we can get into a genre discussion, but I know in John Trunby's Anatomy of Genre, he talks about horror as being like the primal, it's the fight to survive, and how it's inherently religious, and it's one of the simplest yet most just visceral of the genres. And so I'm curious if that's something you would agree with.
The fun part is that it's so hard to define it, and people have argued it for decades. What's the definition of horror? So we're like, oh, it's an emotion. No, it's a genre. Yeah, maybe the simplest emotion, but I don't think that's true. I mean, I think it can be quite complicated. To me, like my favorite works of horror are like, and let's stick to the written word, right? It took this book 300 pages or the short story 20 pages to describe emotion, to describe a set of emotions, that the only way to describe it would be that story. If you were to try to describe it, it wouldn't work as well as, hey, here's the story. Yeah, and as far as, to what you're originally saying, I think all the best art comes from outsiders or people who perceive themselves as outsiders. I don't know, I kind of take that role seriously, frankly, especially now that I've been doing it for a while and that I'm older. I like the idea that horror, believe me, I want it to be popular. I want it to sell, but also at the same time, I do want horror to be a critic of mainstream culture. It should be at the edges. It should be transgressive. It should be asking hard questions and making people feel uncomfortable. I think to me, that's part of its role, I think, in society, and it makes me feel better anyway.
I would say and to our fans who may not be familiar with some of your work, you have achieved popularity. You have M. Night Shyamalan has optioned your work. You have Stephen King praising you. I am curious just because it's M. Night and I grew up with Signs and Sixth Sense, which actually holds up phenomenally well. I rewatched it, and even knowing a little bit of the end, which if you haven't seen it yet, guys, get on that. But what was that like to work with, to have your work sort of, taken on by someone of that name recognition? Surely that fills some of that validation void.
Yeah, it was a very wild experience in every sense of the word. I say I worked with him, which is not necessarily a shot. For most of anyone who gets something adapted, you pretty much cede control over the moment you hand it over, unless you're Stephen King or somebody who is able to negotiate some sort of leverage. But yeah, no, getting to visit the set for 2 days was really sort of a head-spinning experience. It didn't feel like he had walked into my head, but it felt, oh my God, like I walked into an obvious stage production of this book that lived in my head for 15 months when I wrote it. And yeah, so that was like a weird cognitive dissonance thing. It was very exciting, meeting the actors too. Just something like that nerdy, like fan stuff is really cool. It is weird. Like you spend, I don't know, I say you spend, but a lot of writers, I'm sure, think about what it would be like to have something adapted. And of course, like when the reality of it happens, it's both better than you thought it would be, and maybe a little bit more disappointing too. And sometimes maybe even just a little bit disappointed myself in how much I like the movie, but I really don't like the ending. So, the expectations thing, part of me is like, oh, you should just enjoy the whole thing and not worry about the little annoying stuff. Although some of the annoying stuff is less than little. So that's a really weird, messy, complicated answer. Sorry. That's a horror answer for you, Ryan.
There you go.
Complicated, complex.
But also, you can't plead ignorance. If M. Night is taking your work, the ending is going to get changed because who knows the ending of an M. Night movie?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. I can't imagine that's difficult letting go of your baby like that. Because also, no movie, I've never seen a movie that's exactly how I envisioned it. Although I will say, Dune is my favorite book, and I was very impressed with what they did with it. And I thought, you know what? This is as close to the vision I've had. Have you had that experience with something that was adapted that you're like, you know what? This is the closest I could kind of imagine it.
Yeah, I feel like those are special things because it's not a lot where I feel like the book and the movie are both like really good on their own right. I know Stephen King famously doesn't like The Shining, but I love both the movie and the book. My favorite might be Watership Down, the original 1970s cartoon movie, and the book I think are just so amazing. Both are, I think, on the same level of sort of genius. But yeah, as the writer, the weird part is like you wrote the story and now it's become a movie. And if the movie does well at all, most people that know the story are going to know the movie and not know the book version of it. Which I have to admit is a little like, like not full sad face, but a little bit of, it's a little strange.
I know. I have a friend who said, Ryan, have you heard this band? They have so many amazing hits. They did Red Wine. They did Baby, I Love Your Way. And I said, well, that's Neil Diamond. And that's also Peter Frampton. And I said, are you going to say? And she's, yep, it was UB40. And I said, oh, and they did not know that all their songs were covers. And that was a heartbreaking conversation. But hey, I was like, they're still great,
No, yeah, absolutely. Now they can discover it on the internet as well. I hear people go there to find things.
That's right. They do. All right. Well, so let's get into a little bit of writing here. One, congratulations on all of your success. And I know we're entering a very interesting time with writing. But first, and because I want to ask you about AI and I want to ask you about the changing landscape, because that's, to me, one of the scarier things that's happening for anyone. But, did we see the early signs of Paul, who'd be this award-winning author and having his work optioned by Hollywood? Did we see scribbling notes? Did the teacher pull you aside and say, you've got the gift? Any disturbing art that was confiscated, as a brooding artist? What are the signs we saw?
Man, no, it's really almost inexplicable how I became a writer because, when I went to college, I was a math and humanities double major, and mainly math. Humanities was frankly just like a hodgepodge of electives, essentially. And then I went and got my master's in math at the University of Vermont by the skin of my teeth. But what had happened at UVM was I had a lot more free time because I wasn't an undergraduate, and I had a serious girlfriend who's my wife now. We had the long distance relationship thing going. So anyway, what free time I had, I was reading. I fell in love with reading Stephen King. So I spent 2 years really struggling to get this math degree, but by the end of it, I read almost every Stephen King book, and then I had this weird itch to try writing a story. So yeah, no, there was nobody tapping me on the shoulder like, oh, you're a talented writer. Like most of the time, I'm like, why am I even doing this? And I was just sort of writing, sending out short stories, getting rejected. And, eventually I found some other people who were trying to become writers too. And that's really sort of how I found my way. And even the horror thing was kind of funny because I was and still am such a scaredy cat. As a kid, I would sleep with stuffed animals positioned around my head to protect me from the various monsters in my bedroom.
That's just common sense. That's a hedge of protection.
Yeah.
So what was the Stephen King gateway novel for you?
The Stand.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's, so interesting. So it's funny. I obviously think Stephen King he's a cultural icon. How the man cranks out books that are about that thick and such, in perpetuity is beyond me. And he also keeps, he's hit by a car and he's still cranking out the best stuff. And, I really respect that. But I will say The Stand, I read during COVID because everyone said to read it. It was an interesting time, very on brand to read that. And I was a little let down by the buildup between Randall Flagg and everything. And I thought, that's so interesting. And yet what a very interesting story.
Did you read the unabridged or the abridged?
Unabridged.
Unabridged.
Oh, I did. I stood through it all.
Yeah, there's a lot of people argue that the abridged is better, maybe for what you were referencing. The one I had read is the unabridged, the big fat long one. Yeah, I recently listened to it on audio for the first time in 30 years, and yeah, it was different listening to it now with that 30-year span and actually, going through COVID, et cetera.
Oh, it's a wild book. Okay, so admittedly, and this is not going to help me get Stephen King on this show, I am like Steinbeck. I'm like respect, appreciate, read East of Eden, was thoroughly depressed for about a month and said, I'm not doing that again. What's my next Stephen King book I should give a shot to?
Oh. Well, two of my favorites of his are probably his most bleakest. Pet Cemetery is amazing. And if you do audiobooks, and as your listeners probably do a lot of audio, the audio book is performed by the dude who plays Dexter. And so
Okay.
he does a really good job, yeah. And more recently, if you want to try more recent King, he has a novel called Revival. Again, very scary, very bleak, heavy on characters, and then at the end, it's just, oh man, it'll just cut you, but like in the best way. Uncle Steve will put his arm around you and then he'll gut you.
All right. Anyone that has Uncle Steve, beware. So no science. So a math geek, and so gets into that and does not see the future in horror. And then walk us through your first foray into short stories, and then kind of get us a little bit, your first big break and your first big letdown, and then your success.
Yeah, so I guess the shortest version possible was that in the mid to late 90s, writing was very much a hobby. I was also I was teaching myself how to play guitar. Honestly, I wanted to be a punk musician, but unfortunately I found out I was a better writer than musician, so I sort of stuck with it. But in the early 2000s, I started selling short stories, selling magazines and online magazines. When I first wrote a novel that I liked, I spent 2 years trying to find an agent. 2 years, hundreds of rejects, but I was just patient with it. And, an agent finally said, hey, I want to, I think you're talented. I want to represent you, kind of thing. So in 2007, we sold my first novel, which was actually a quirky detective novel. It's called The Little Sleep, and it features a narcoleptic Lithuanian private detective in South Boston. That's a great.
And that's a play off Raymond Chandler, I'm assuming.
Yes, definitely, yeah. And so I thought I had it made because, big publisher, it came out in 2009. That book did okay, but there was a lot of turmoil at the publisher and they didn't have much support behind me. And the second book tanked and they basically said, no, we don't want to see any more from you. And that was really hard, frankly. I spent like 2010 through 2012 just being kind of like bitter and jealous and upset. And thankfully, I wasn't like a jerk to people online, but just more inside my own head. And I think it's no secret that once I learned how to better deal with those, you're always going to feel those feelings. You're human. But once I learned how to sort of like release and acknowledge them, the moment I did, the idea for the novel that ended up breaking me out, A Head Full of Ghosts, landed in my lap. I think it was sort of like my mental health reward for being better about those feelings. So yeah, in some ways it was a really long, slow ride, but once The Head Full of Ghosts hit, things have really been sort of zooming forward since then.
I guess when you say you have a, bitterness, resentment, and hatred just, brooding in your mind, I was like, that sounds like great material for an inevitable horror novel. Yeah. And I'm assuming you made it through without the, drugs and booze and, and partying all night, because there's two ways to get the material. It sounds like just inner turmoil was enough, right?
Yeah. No, I just punished myself by teaching high school mathematics. That was sort of how I flogged myself.
I'm sure students felt torture as well. Now, to stay with it and to get rejected for 2 years, this is a common thing. Almost every author I've had is, you're going to get rejected for 2 years. So at one point I wonder, do you even care about rejection? Because it seems like you're actually not an author. Like, I'd be worried if the first person said yes.
Yeah. No, that's a part of it. Like the weird part, like it does and it doesn't. Like you said, it makes sense. Like you get it and you sort of become immune to it, but I don't. Like, I don't read online reviews from randos, especially the negative ones. That really bothers me. And it's actually part of it is I'm disappointed in myself that it still bothers me. So I just know to avoid that stuff. So part of it, honestly, part of being a writer is you need luck, you need hard work, you do need talent, but you also need persistence. That's the biggest thing. Just, if I throw math out there one last time, I always thought of it as sending out a short story or sending out a query letter to an agent was an opportunity. And I just tried to accumulate opportunities. And no matter how many rejects I had, the hope was I'm just going to gather all these opportunities. I only need one. I only need one to hit. And that's really kind of what happened with The Head Full of Ghosts. Even after the first 2 books didn't do so well, we resent out to editors, and there was this one editor who believed in me, and she's been my champion ever since. And I see that story play out very often. In fact, I was just discussing with another writer friend, Stephen Graham Jones, who I would recommend to everybody. He and I have had in some ways similar paths where it was like sort of slow and herky-jerky. And he talked about, again, the idea of persistence. He said he's glad he didn't hit right away because he's seen too many authors who've hit right away and then don't know what to do with rejection after that kind of thing, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's funny how 100 positive reviews, but that one negative review just shouts at you and screams at you. I'm bad about that too, because even on our show with the Exorcist Files, I'll have 90 people email me and say, "This was terrifying. This is amazing. Way to go." And then one person's, "Yeah, it was stupid." And I will feel the need to write them a note politely. And I'm like, "No, like, why? You don't reward that behavior." So I eventually had to stop, reading them as well, because they just, you don't forget the negative ones. They sting. I want to talk about your ideation and writing process. So, do you have the sort of Doc Brown flux capacitor? Are you working and then you hit your head and it's, oh, head full of ghosts? Or how about a house in New Hampshire at the end of, an apocalyptic dystopian future? Or are you saying, you know what, it's time for something else? Here's a few things I'm brooding on. What do I want to do? Ask a few friends, you get their reaction. Walk us through kind of that initial ideations concept.
That's a great question. It's kind of actually, it's funny. The two examples of the two books that you mentioned are sort of represent to me like both ends of the spectrum. I kind of feel like I've experienced it all just because I've written, I'm at this weird place where I've written over 10 novels and, over 100 short stories probably. So sometimes it is like the fun eureka moment. Like A Head Full of Ghosts was a fun eureka moment, like the kind you dream of, where I just happened to be reading a book of essays about the film The Exorcist. And I was like, like this was 2013 when I was reading it. No one's really written a possession story, a novel in a long time. We see the movies all the time. And I was like, how would I do one? And the story just like sort of fell into my lap. It was amazing. But with The Cabinet at the End of the World, I had to force it. Like I didn't know. And in fact, my editor had just rejected a different novel idea. He was like, yeah, send me something else. And I was actually on the plane ride home I was at a festival in Los Angeles. And usually I'll take out a notebook and do some brainstorming a lot if I'm stuck. And I drew a little cabin in my notebook and I looked at the cabin. I was like, oh, and it made me think of home invasion stories. And I just started playing with it. I was like, oh, I don't like home invasion stories. I was like, oh, how would I write one that I would like? And I kind of forced my way into the story from there. So I don't know. I could just, if you do it enough, you just kind of learn to follow your creepy brain or your weird brain into places. Sometimes it's a dead end, but that's fine. You still want to follow it because you're not sure. And you want to keep rewarding your brain for giving you ideas. I feel, if every idea that came to me is, now that's terrible. My brain would be like, screw you then. I'm not bringing you anything. So I kind of have to reward the weird little thing inside.
How do you know when you have an idea that kind of works versus, I see this in film and TV a lot where you go, that's an awesome premise. And then you're like, all right, now what? What's the difference for you when you know I have an idea versus, oh, I actually have a book or a story here?
Yeah, for me, geez, I wish I was smart enough to know if it's going to work or not. Half the time I feel like I'm muscling it into working or hopefully working. For me, it's about, I'm always excited when I get a new idea, as I'm sure you are or anybody is that, writes or makes music or art. The test for me is I won't just dive in right away. I'll let the idea sort of linger for maybe a few weeks. And if I find myself thinking about it when I'm not thinking about it, I'm doing laundry or doing dishes or something and it's nagging at me, that's to me the sign, I need to write this. Because there are plenty of times where I'm like, yeah, you know what? Like the thought of working on this seems like work or it doesn't seem like it would be fun. I sort of let those go away. So it's to me the big test that I know, okay, this thing just won't stop bothering me. I'm going to have to do something with it.
Do you outsource and do you ask people, hey, what do you think of this? Or do you just trust your gut and go for it?
No, never. That's me. I should say no. Like I have a trusted writer friend, John Langan, who's a brilliant writer. He wrote a novel called The Fisherman, which I would highly recommend to everybody if you haven't read it. I'll never run an idea by it, but once I'm in the going of writing, we'll talk to each other and say, hey, this is where I am. What do you think? But honestly, I try to keep most of it to myself until it's a done thing. Because I've learned by having shown people like partials, including my agents, and their comments really almost derailed the whole thing. Not necessarily their fault, but I found I just don't work well that way. I need to write it the way I think it needs to be written, and then we'll fix it afterwards if we have to.
All right, let's talk. I listened to James Patterson's masterclass, and it's interesting to hear. I think Joe Lansdale on the show, he said he kind of just gets up and writes and he doesn't really do a lot of plotting and outlining. He just goes for it. And then Patterson, which makes sense given how many he's come up with, but he said 90% of his work was actually outlining, scene, et cetera. So that when it came time to write, it was actually kind of fill in, the brackets, which was like solving an equation. So where do you kind of fall on that spectrum as far as your workflow process?
So I've done both with novels, especially. And when I first started, I outlined more than not outline, and partially because I felt least confident in plot. Like I wanted, and my outlines probably were certainly nowhere near as detailed as someone like Patterson. They'd be at the most 10 pages. But I did find that very helpful, especially with some of my earliest novels. But some novels I didn't, like A Head Full of Ghosts. I just sort of kept the notes as I went. And actually, the run of recent novels, the last two or three for me, I haven't outlined either. But I don't know, you have to be, I think in some ways that you do have to be flexible, especially if you start publishing with somebody, because my publisher at times have required some sort of summary. Um, Not because let's say like I had a 2-book deal and like I wanted to try to get another book deal with them. They said, okay, we need to see 50 pages in the summary. So even if I wasn't planning on writing a summary, I had to write one for them anyway.
I also read or heard in one of your interviews that it sounds like we're similar in this regard. You self-edit along the way. I hate that about my writing process is that I am constant. It's like having a critic over my shoulder, constantly redoing stuff, etc. How do you go through editing?
Yeah, so I do a lot of editing as I go. It's just that's the way it works best for me. I wish I was someone who could spill it all out. I say that, but I've never worked that way. It's been over, 20 years at this point. So maybe I should stop wishing working a different way because it seems to be working for me. You know, I do a lot of editing as I go. When I'm going well, I try to aim for 500 words a day, but I always start with what I wrote the day before. And if it's a novel, I usually start like at the start of the chapter or the start of a break. So sometimes it feels like I'm not moving forward because typically, like I guess I'm sort of the opposite of a lot of people's. I write a little bit, but then I expand as opposed to blathering it all out and then cutting. I don't know. It's just the way that I approach it.
So walk us through a day. If you got now these deadlines, are these like psychological just weights? Is this like rucking? Is it just something that looms and you can never like it follows? It just never escapes you, you know?
I've never thought of it in those terms, but no, they definitely loom. I need them. I think they help, and I'm so neurotic. I'm gonna knock on wood, neurotically early that I haven't missed a deadline. I turned in one book the day it was due, and my editors, oh, you can be late. Don't tell me that. I don't want to be late. Yeah, I find that they help me.
I know, just it follows. It's like a new horror movie. It's like a deadline that always is on. It's like anyone who does podcasting, you must always have content, no matter how big the reservoir. You must always be producing. Day to day, what's it look like? You get up right in the morning. Do you put on music? Walk us through a little bit of Paul's office.
Still, I joked about being a high school math teacher. I have been one, and I still am. I took 1 year off, 22, 23, when the movie was being made, which was nice. It was a year of sabbatical. So if it's during the school year, sometimes if I could sneak in a free period at school, I'll do some work at school. When I was a lot younger, I was better at it. I would, the kids would be taking a quiz and I would be writing, had no idea if they were cheating or not. But now that space has sort of been taken up by checking email or social media. So these days, if it's a school night, like I'll try to sneak in an hour at night before I go to bed. But on off days, I prefer to write in the morning. So I'll get up, make an absurdly sized cup of black tea. I'll write with music, but only if it's really noisy in the house. I prefer not to have music.
A sports book they'll put on radio broadcasts. If you're writing fantasy, they have a Lord of the Rings soundtrack. Do you find music kind of that voice you're looking for?
Yes and no, because most of the stuff I've been writing to, one, it can't have lyrics. It has to be instrumental. It has to be a soundtrack, or sometimes I have a collection of Bela Bartok symphonies, which are really sort of intense. So there's a lot of horror-centric stuff or horror-adjacent stuff I'm listening to. The band Swans, they have lyrics sometimes, but Michael Vieira is more like an instrument, his vocals. Yeah.
And then how long do you write? Like I remember Joe said he was like, I write 3 hours and then I'm done. And he goes, the rest of the day I'm working, but I'm watching TV, I'm hanging out. I need to fill the cup with just inspiration. So he said, I loved his interview because he gave license to say, look, you can only write so much of the days. I'm not going to sit there and stare at a screen for 8 hours. I'm going to go write. And then I'm going to go out and just look at nature. I'm going to take a walk. I'm going to watch TV, consume stories. Do you share that sort of perspective?
Yeah, I think I'm definitely closer to Joe. And the year off I took, it took me a while to probably even get up to 3 hours because it's been so long that I've only been able to steal like an hour or two at most. And usually by the end of 2 hours, I find like I'm totally exhausted. When I had that year off, I did find like I could write in the morning, go for a walk, work out, have lunch, and maybe do a little bit of light editing in the afternoon. But, then also, read all the books I'm set and stuff like that. Yeah, no, I might fall on I like Joe's schedule. I hope to be on that again someday.
Do you have to disable the Wi-Fi or how's distraction for you?
I don't. I probably should. I get distracted sometimes, but if I do, that's probably a sign. I'll just get up, walk around and try to reset, come back to the table.
Do you, in the midst of a story, ever panic and go, oh man, I'm not feeling this? Or how often does it happen where you go from like initial phase, This is epic. Literally, I'm the next Stephen King. This is fantastic. This is internal monologue, not spoken.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then a week later, all right, just got to grind. And then a month later, oh, dear God, does this plot even work? What am I doing? Is that how similar a journey is that?
Yeah.
Asking for a friend.
Yeah. No, it's a day-to-day thing. The days where I feel really good about what I wrote are victories. Most days I'm more like, feeling like Eeyore about everything. However, I always feel good for having written or having spent a couple of hours especially if I made the 500 words. I'm like, all right, if I wasn't happy about today, I'll fix it tomorrow is usually the way I approach it. But yeah, no, it is weird. And again, it's another sort of disappointment. I sort of assumed when I was a younger, newer writer, it's like, oh, all these self-doubts would go away if you've been doing it long enough. I'm like, no, it's the same, if not more.
And once you have a successful novel, does that actually, I have a friend we had on the show, and he said the second novel's terrifying because do I even have, did I get lucky? There's the voice of, can I do this again? Did you have any of that, obviously, after you hit it with Head Full of Ghosts?
Oh yeah, I had to go through the second novel thing twice because with the Little Sleep, they wanted me to write a sequel. Essentially, I had no plans of writing a sequel, so it was one of the hardest things I ever did. Very proud of the book. It was really hard to write, and then 5 years pass, and now A Head Full of Ghosts comes out, and I felt really good about that book. When I was writing the follow up, I was really freaking out. I was like, oh, this is so hard. I don't think it's as good as A Head Full of Ghosts. And I've told the story before, but I'll say it one more time really briefly. I have a wonderful friend and mentor, Stuart Renan, who's just an amazing novelist. And I sent him this big, long email in the middle of writing Disappearance to Devil's Rock. I'm like, oh, no, this book I don't think it's as good as the previous one. It's so hard, blah, 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 a big, whiny email. You sort of expect like he'll send you back like a pat on the head. Don't worry, Paul, you can do it. You're a good writer. And he sent me back one line and it said, not everything you write is going to be great. And I started laughing, but it was exactly what I needed to hear because it helped release a lot of the self-pressure I was putting on in the comparison to the other book. I was like, yeah, this is a different book. This is going to be what it is. I just have to try to make it whatever it's supposed to be and not compare it to this other thing.
Absolutely. And also, do you find solace in that also literature is subjective? There are things that we know make a good story. Like it's interesting. We have external validation metrics, success, et cetera. But obviously, I imagine you have many friends who are extraordinarily talented who don't have any of the modicum of success that you do. And so do authors have to just live with this knowledge that it's hard work, it's talent, but some people just, the zeitgeist or whatever it was is the right place, right time.
Yeah, no, no, all that you said is true. It is strange. It's subjective, but also to a point, I'm not saying this about my work, but there's a reason why like some movies and some books are universally acclaimed as these are classics. There is it might be hard to be like objectively point out why people continue to watch Casablanca or people can continue to read, something like Kurt Vonnegut or Shirley Jackson, but it's there. It has to be there somewhere. There's a reason why these things appeal to people through the ages.
Yeah.
With accepting that there is a subjectivity. But yes, the whims of publishing, like who gets published, like who gets a great editor, who has the luck of a great editor, who has the luck of a sales team and a publicity team that believes in you and they're going to put some muscle behind you. Even then, it doesn't guarantee that the book is going to get read. It can be frustrating. It's terrifying, for someone who wants to maybe write full time at some point, because that rug could just be pulled out from under you at any moment through no fault of your own. Never mind like doing something stupid and having it be your fault. But no, I am friends with so many brilliant writers, super talented, hardworking writers who just, for whatever reason, haven't had the break yet, and you hope that it comes.
I thought a great show would be interview all those editors who turned you down, or can you imagine all the editors that turned down Harry Potter or the publishers and just see how you doing now? Yeah. How do you feel about that? Once you got published, was there a little bit of schadenfreude of, suck it guys, once you get it, was there a temptation at all to anonymously email, again, asking for a friend?
Yeah. Not other writers, or editors. My schadenfreude was more towards, the kids who picked on me and made fun of me in high school, which is sort of embarrassing to admit, but that's sort of why it still motivates me is like the show. These people that I don't even talk to anymore or have no, don't even see them on social media. Yeah, it's weird.
It's not a big shock. Typically, math focus is, probably correlated more with being picked on than, say, majoring in PE.
True.
The physical sciences. Do you just love teaching? I'm curious. I would think you've had so much success, you could do something else, but do you just love forming young minds? Or is it just the cafeteria is great?
I do teaching. Hey, don't underestimate free power, free food, free lunch.
There is such a thing.
But yeah, it's honestly, it's also been, I've always viewed it artistically as my financial safety net. It's a job I like. I do get, more time off than other people working full-time jobs. So it affords me more time to write. But I always felt, okay, I can write the books I want to write and not have to try to chase the market, if that makes sense. Because if I write something no one picks up, I still get my shitty health insurance from my school. And I do emphasize shitty. But now that, the books are doing well and I'm older, I don't know, I probably could, but I'm waiting for, let's see, my oldest daughter is still a college. I've had two kids. One just graduated and she's got a few more years in college, and college is really expensive. Yeah. So that's part of why, but I don't tell my school, but yeah, I'm definitely seriously considering leaving within the next year or two.
Wow. Okay. I'm curious too, at your school, because obviously Stephen King was a teacher. Is there like an English teacher that has that novel that never got published that's jealous of you? The math teacher it's kind of unfair that you're teaching math and a published horror writer. Like it's kind of a slap in the face to that English teacher.
Yeah, he doesn't like it when I wear my book covers like sandwich boards and just walk by his classroom every day. No, I am, like my school has been very supportive. I have zero complaints. Beyond supportive, like, to the point where, if I have to miss some school days here and there because I go to a conference, to a literary festival or something, a lot of places I think would give me grief, and they don't, not at all. So yeah, they've been super cool. And actually, there's another writer in the English department who had a novel come out a year and a half ago. Did quite well critically. So yeah, we're doing all right.
So I'm curious, is math a thing you're just good at and you do, or do you have a secret, like, is there some poetic thing about math that you can share, broader lessons for life? Do you take refuge in is it life was chaos and I love the order of math and the absolute rules that exist, or what draws you to math?
I don't know. It just makes sense in my brain. And I mean, as a kid, I loved like baseball statistics, and I just would pore over them in the newspaper. I loved, messing around with that kind of stuff. So those are the kind of numbers I've always been sort of obsessed with. And I, frankly, like it was like I stuck with it because I was good at it. Like when I was applying, I graduated high school in 1989. The college process was much different then, so much less high pressure than it is now. I was like, oh, like I was the first person on both sides of my family that would be going to college. I was like, oh, I picked the school I went to because I liked their basketball team, frankly. That was the best school I got into. So yeah, much different than it is now.
So I know you studied advanced math. This is a naive question from someone who does not excel in math, but I am curious. When they say, like, when they award, people for breakthroughs in math, I always go, what are they discovering now in math? Like, I thought a lot of the rules, I know in 89, calculus was just being sort of cemented at that point. What are we discovering about math at this point?
I have to admit, I don't keep up with the newest discoveries, but yeah, some really like crazy stuff. Even when I was in grad school, like the dean of the math department had a grant from NASA because he had constructed the mathematical model of the human brain and was testing gravity on his mathematical model. Somewhat attached, but I would just recommend, if you're really into math horror, you need to read a book called The Maniac by Benjamin Labatat. A brilliant book. And it's actually it's a nonfiction novel, meaning like all the stuff that happened is true. He's just imagining the interactions between some of these real mathematicians. And there was this Hungarian mathematician who was there for giant leaps of logic in the 1920s, the nuclear bomb, the first computer, which was built in 1950 something, which I didn't realize was built that early. And he's really sort of like the godfather of AI as well. And the dude was a full-on sociopath, psychopath. Honestly, this book is one of the most terrifying cosmic horror novels I've ever read, and it's true. So like you mentioned AI earlier, if people want to understand sort of the mindset behind like why like these, in theory, smart people wanted to take over, this is an example of it. Or that book features an example of it, yeah.
Yeah, so it sounds like we need to renew your subscription to Math Weekly so you can get the latest updates in math. Because I left it a long time ago. So you mentioned, the elephant in the room. So AI is so interesting, and I love the polarized response. Some say it will never exceed humans because it's only as good as the inputs being put into it. Others are, this is Skynet, and we got to find John Connor, and we got to get rid of this thing like ASAP. But from a writer's perspective, how do you view AI right now? Are you nervous about it? Do you think, oh, hey, it's still a ways out and it's not going to do it, or it ever will be able to, imitate and kind of do what you and Stephen King do?
Yeah. I'm not optimistic. And I honestly can't say too much.
Because I think I read this when this came out in the news is that there's concern that these models are where they're getting their data and they're just scraping a lot of, copyrighted information, right? And it's all inherently built from something because AI as itself can't just make new stuff for itself, right?
Yeah, that's pretty much the gist of it. Is where how are our books being used? Where'd they come from? Why
Yeah.
aren't we being paid?
Do you think ultimately we've crossed the path though or the point where AI will be used as part of and maybe to make it fair, there was a time when you had to go to the library to look up something and then Google came along and it changed that process and we don't think twice about it. I'm sure there was someone going, I had to go to the library when I was a writer and now it's Google. Is there a world where does AI have a place where it's just, hey, it's going to be used for outlining and it's just like a virtual assistant and that's going to change, the workflow for writers?
I don't know what that world looks like. I am of the opinion, this is my singular personal opinion, that there's no ethical way to use large language models currently because they do not ask for the author's permission and they do not pay the authors for usage of their books.
Do you think that humans, like one thing I've held to, and this might be a little naive, is that there's something, if we subscribe to the fact that humans potentially are more than, flesh and blood, that they have some sort of metaphysical, sort of spiritual aspect to them. And when they create something, there's this human element that's kind of hard, maybe something that Gladwell would probably write a book on, this thing that makes it inherently human. And that no matter how efficient AI gets at imitating, that it can't actually capture the human response, et cetera. Would you think that's possible? Like as humans, we just have a unique thing in us that we like a spark that we can write that machines won't be able to capture.
Yeah, without speaking to whatever machines can or can't do. This is me talking about what draws me to art as art is communication. And, even when I mentioned this maybe a little bit briefly, I'm talking about horror in particular, which is about, scary, awful stuff. I actually find that hopeful. And the reason why is because if I watch a horror movie or read a book and I really connect with it, my initial response is, oh, they feel like I do. They recognize this. And it makes me feel less alone and it makes me feel less overwhelmed because there is this magical personal connection between the writer and the reader or someone standing in front of a beautiful work of art. This was made by a person. There's that communication. And to me, that is a fundamental aspect of art. I think, was it, like Guillermo del Toro recently said something about, the test of a piece of art. Am I going to go out of my way to see this or watch this to view this, right? That's, because I want to know something about this person that made this.
Yeah. It's also interesting too, right? It's the struggle. I forget who was talking about this. They talk about art as struggle. And when you view something and you intake something that there's a part of the author and you're like, what was going on in Paul's head? Like, really, when he wrote this, like what was happening? And man, there's some bad students in his class if he's writing this for, Cal. And so now, of course, the AI person would say, if you don't know an AI wrote it, then you wouldn't know. But I think when I buy a book by Paul Tremblay, I'm like, oh, I'm reading it also with the interaction of what was Paul going through, like his process. Like it's just hard to quantify. And I'm hopeful that that will remain, that without struggle, without James Cameron taking 10 years to make Titanic, this is why sports work, right? Because, yes, machines can, of course, do better things than humans, but we care about two people, the level playing field, live in that room, doing something inherently human, competing with each other. And I think art is this kind of competition that I don't know if AI can replace, because every story's got a journey from birth to finish. So I don't know. I'm hopeful, but yeah. Now I do have to ask, just because he praised your work, have you ever interacted with Stephen King? Have you got a chance to meet him?
Yeah, so we've not met in person, but we've exchanged a bunch of emails. Yeah, so no, he's super nice, super gracious. He's been incredibly supportive of my stuff, to the point where it's like hard to believe. I started becoming a reader, never mind a writer, because of him. So no, it's his support is definitely like one of the top highlights of my writing career.
What if you found out his emails were from his AI? That would be, how sad would that be? That's now how cool just to grow up, like to meet someone and be mentored and kind of just interact with someone whose work kind of led you down this career. And a similar story too, teacher as well. I love that story. When he threw away his copy of Carrie and his wife picked it up and read it and was like, don't get rid of this. That's so cool. All right. We have to ask, as we wrap up here, advice for aspiring writers. I know you get asked this a lot, but for someone, maybe there's two camps. One, I'm thinking about being a writer. I'm not sure. And then two, I do want to be a writer. I know this. What's Paul's wisdom for them?
Yeah. I mean, I think it goes back to, you have to give two things, I would say. You have to be kind to yourself because a lot of people aren't going to be kind to you. Be as kind as you can be to yourself. So with them is, try to beat yourself up less, but also be persistent. Like, you've poured your heart into the story and you're submitting it and you're waiting to hear back from it. And the human urge is to be like, just to sit there and fret and wait and be like, you know what, I'm not going to write today. I'm not going to write tomorrow. It's like, no, you submit, you start working on the next thing and the next thing after that. It's really hard. There are so few people who just sit down. The first thing they write gets published, and it's happily ever after that. I'm sure there's been a case or two of that, but the vast majority of us are just people who write and continue to write and would write if there wasn't, X amount of people reading. They just write because they have to.
And as far as the day-to-day discipline, James Patterson had a fun line where I worked at an advertising agency and I got up to write before that. And he's like, you know how you know if you're a writer? You'll write. If it's been 2 years and you haven't written anything, you're not a writer. So do you kind of share some of that tough love? Is it a thing where you just got to buckle up and do it? Or do you think if it's something you really want to do, it'll come naturally?
With the caveat that everybody's work's different. I have a friend who binge writes. He'll rent a hotel and get all the Red Bulls and things with caffeine and write for 18 hours a day. I cannot do that. And he's not. So there are people who do it differently. But yeah, generally, if you want to be a writer, you have to write. Like, there's some days I don't feel like writing. I force myself to sit and do it. And I feel better for having done it. Like, I literally dragging myself to the laptop, feeling like, this is going to be horrible. I don't feel like it. I don't want to. But I feel better after doing it. And it's just that muscle memory helps. It helps. There's too many people that do that for it not to be like sort of like the way or a way, I don't want to say the best way, but a common way to becoming a writer is just actually sitting around and doing it.
Now, War of Art, man. Stephen Pressfield is right. That resistance, man. It's always there. I always want a snack. I want to get a water. I don't know what it is. There's that it's cool to hear that successful authors like you still battle that and have to get up every morning and wage war against it.
Yeah. No, it's a battle that's not going to be won. I'm just trying to fight it to a stalemate each day.
Good. All right. That's good. It's sort of a geopolitical philosophy, of reasons. Just see, it's just, preserve. Now, I did want to ask you, because you are a writer of horror and thrillers here, have you had anything particularly chilling or a paranormal experience or anything at all that you could talk about?
None. I am boring.
Wow.
Like, I'm a pretty much non-believer 99% of the time. The other 1% of the time is if I'm in a dark basement running up the stairs, or if I wake up after having a terrible nightmare, which I still do. But yeah, no, I've not experienced the supernatural. And I don't want to either. I don't want to be proven wrong.
When you got married, were you already a horror writer? Because I'm curious if your wedding vows were terrifying at all.
Just started. Like, my wife and I had been dating, lived together for about 5 years before we got married. But it's actually her fault. She bought me The Stand. She's the one that can be blamed for it all.
Well, I was going to say, that'd be a great skit, is the vows of, you take a bunch of horror writers who get married and you think this, or the toast, right? Listen up, Well, that's awesome. What do we got cooking right now, Paul? And where can people check out more of your work? And what are you excited about right now?
Sure. Well, my newest novel, horror movie novel, is out there, causing trouble. Next summer, I might have my first middle grade novel. Sorry, kids. And that's called Another. And you know what it is, a horror novel. I'm really excited about that book. It's not like a planned career pivot. I just happen to have the idea. I'm definitely going to go back to writing adult novels, which I have an adult novel due to my publisher in May. But so horror movie, Another. Oh, a situation, The Stand. Next summer, there's an anthology of stories called The End of the World as We Know It. And it's a set of 34 stories that take place in the universe of The Stand. And the editors got permission from Stephen King for other writers to write stories within the world of The Stand.
Cool.
So it's 36 different, mid-30s different writers. Yeah, so I'm super honored, super excited that I got to write a story that was set in the world of The Stand.
That's awesome. Very cool. Man, that's awesome. Are you, I should ask you, are you a Dean Koontz fan at all? I'm actually Koontz was kind of my introduction to more horror thriller stuff. It's funny. He's done a lot of books, but doesn't get kind of mentioned as much as Stephen.
I have to admit, I am not. I read one book once. I can't remember the title. It was fine, but I didn't dive into the rest of it.
So Dean, if you're listening, I'm really sorry. I know you probably have enough comparison issues with Stephen King, but hey, no, I'm your fan, so. Paul, thank you so much, man. This was so fun, and congrats on all your success. And M. Night, if you're watching, why'd you change the ending, man?
Thank you, Ryan. No, this was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, man. All right, folks, thanks so much. And if you are debating writing something, Go write it now.